I used to believe that love and sacrifice were the same thing, that if you worked hard enough, saved enough, prayed enough, the man you were building a future with would be building it with you too. I was wrong, and I didn't find out the way you'd expect. No phone, no password, no late-night argument where the truth slips out by accident. I found out standing in the middle of a shopping plaza, holding a bag of cheap plastic chairs I had just bought for my own engagement party, the one I was planning, budgeting, and paying for almost entirely by myself. I saw him, Emmanuel, my fiancé of 2 years, walking out of a store I could never afford to shop in, carrying bags I didn't recognize for a woman I had never seen in my life. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly how a man can make a woman believe they're struggling together while he's secretly funding someone else's entire lifestyle. And you'll see exactly how karma collects its debt with interest years later in a room neither of us expected to be in. My name is Sharon. This is what happened. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened. This isn't a story of a foolish woman who didn't see the signs. I saw plenty of signs. I just read them as struggle, not betrayal. There's a difference, and that difference is what kept me loyal for as long as I was. Emmanuel and I met 4 years ago at a friend's housewarming in Lagos. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He was the one quietly helping the host fix a generator that wouldn't start, sleeves rolled up, laughing at his own bad jokes about how he was an engineer by day, generator doctor by night. I liked that about him immediately. He didn't perform for attention. Or so I thought. We started dating 3 months later. He was working a mid-level job at a logistics company, and I was working as an accounts officer at a small manufacturing firm. Neither of us was rich, neither of us pretended to be. We used to sit on the floor of his one-room apartment in Ogba, eating rice from the same plate because we only owned one good plate, laughing about how one day we'd have a real dining table. That was the foundation. Shared struggle, shared dreams. At least, that's what I believed it was. When he proposed 2 years into our relationship, it wasn't extravagant. He took me to this small buka where we had our first proper date, got down on one knee in front of the woman who sold us beans and plantain every Sunday, and said, "Sharon, I don't have much, but I have all of it for you." The woman selling beans started crying before I did. I said yes without hesitation. From that day, we started planning. Not a big wedding, we didn't have big money, but a wedding that would be ours. We agreed on a budget, split based on what we could realistically each save. He said his contribution would come from his salary and a few side jobs, logistics consulting he called it, helping small businesses set up delivery systems. I didn't question that. Lagos is a city where everyone has a side hustle. I thought I was being a supportive partner by not prying into the details. So I focused on my own savings. I want you to sit with what I did over those 2 years because it matters for how the story ends. I worked my regular job, then did freelance bookkeeping for 2 small shops on weekends. I trekked instead of taking a bus to save the extra naira. I stopped buying new clothes. Every outfit I wore that final year was something old, restyled, reworn. I packed lunch instead of buying food outside. I turned down 2 different weekend trips with friends because I didn't want to touch the wedding account, not even once. Every kobo I saved went into a dedicated account I'd opened specifically for the wedding. I named it Sharon's Big Day, so I'd see those words every time I logged in as a reminder of why I was sacrificing so much in the present for something in the future. Emmanuel knew about this account. He used to ask me how much was in it, how the savings were going, whether we thought we'd reach our targets before the date we'd picked. I always told him honestly. I never once thought to ask him the same question with the same intensity, because I assumed, foolishly I now know, that a man who proposed to me in a buka, a man who once told me he didn't have much, wouldn't suddenly be hiding wealth or spending it elsewhere. There were small things, looking back, that I explained away. He started dressing a little sharper, new shoes, a new watch wrist. When I asked, he said a client had paid him well and he wanted to look the part for future meetings. It made sense. Image matters in business. He started being busier on weekends, the very weekends we used to spend together, planning the wedding, visiting venues, comparing prices for chairs and canopies. He said the side business was demanding more time now, that this was actually good news because it meant more money for the wedding. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. About 8 months before everything fell apart, I asked if we could check our combined savings so we could start booking vendors. He hesitated just for a second, then said his money was tied up. He'd reinvested into equipment, a delivery bike for a bigger contract, and it would free up soon. He promised that by the time we needed to pay vendors, his share would be ready. I didn't push. I trusted him. The way you trust is someone you've built a life with, is someone who knelt in front of a bean seller and called you his everything. By the time I saw him in that shopping plaza, Sharon's big day had grown to an amount that represented almost 2 years of discipline, of saying no to small joys so I could say yes to a future. Hold on to that because it matters very soon.
It was a Saturday, ordinary in every way, until it wasn't. I had taken the morning off from my freelance bookkeeping to run errands for our upcoming engagement party, the formal one where both families would officially meet. I was the one organizing most of it because Emmanuel said his work schedule that month was unpredictable due to a major new contract. My list that day was long and unglamorous. Confirm the caterer's final head count, pick up a deposit receipt from the event hall, and buy plastic chairs and a few decoration items from a market plaza that had cheaper prices than anywhere else in town. I remember exactly what I was wearing, a faded Ankara wrapper skirt I'd had for 3 years because I'd stopped buying new clothes, and a plain white top. I remember exactly how tired my feet were because I'd walked from one end of that plaza to the other, comparing prices on white plastic chairs, because the difference of 50 naira per chair multiplied by 150 chairs actually mattered to my budget. I had just paid for the chairs. I'd be lying if I wasn't a little proud of myself for negotiating the seller down. When I was walking toward the exit of the plaza, arms full of bags, when I saw him, Emmanuel. He was about 30 feet away, standing outside one of the more expensive boutiques in that plaza, the kind of shop I'd walked past 100 times but never once walked into, because everything in the window cost more than I made bookkeeping for an entire week. He wasn't alone. There was a woman with him, tall, polished, dressed like she'd stepped out of one of those Instagram pages that sell a lifestyle as much as clothing. Fitted dress, designer bag hanging from her elbow, hair freshly done, the kind of presence that turns heads without trying. She was laughing at something he'd said, and he was laughing too, easy and warm, in a way I hadn't seen on his face in months, not since before he'd gotten busy. He was carrying bags, several of them, branded ones, the kind with the store's logo printed on thick paper tied with ribbon, the universal signal of money spent without hesitation. He handed 2 of the bags to her, like it was the most natural thing in the world, the way you'd hand someone their own groceries. I stood there. I didn't move. I didn't call out. Something in me, some instinct I didn't fully understand yet, told me to just watch. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet and paid for something else at a small kiosk near the boutique, drinks I think, 2 bottles of something cold, and handed one to her. She took it, said something, and he laughed again, that same easy laugh. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think people expect a dramatic explosion of rage, and that's not what happened. What happened was quieter and somehow worse. It was the slow, sick arrival of clarity. Every excuse he'd given me over the past year, the busy weekends, the new clothes, the tied-up money, the unpredictable schedule, rearranged themselves in my mind into a single ugly picture. I wasn't looking at a man stressed by a demanding new business contract. I was looking at a man who had a second life. And from the ease between them, the familiarity, the casual way he paid for things without checking a price tag first, this wasn't new. This had been going on for a while. I didn't approach them. I want to be clear about that. Because if I had walked up right there, this story would have a very different middle. I would have made a scene. He would have had time to lie, to explain, to manage the story before I'd gathered enough facts to understand what I was actually dealing with. I've watched enough of these situations play out. Friends, cousins, women online sharing their own stories, to know that confronting a cheating man in the moment almost always gives him the upper hand because he gets to control the narrative in real time and you're too emotionally flooded to think clearly. Instead, I turned around. I walked to a different exit of the plaza. I got into a bus going home, sat by the window with my bags of plastic chairs on my lap, and I let myself shake quietly for the entire ride, while the world outside the window kept moving like nothing had happened. By the time I got home, I had made a decision that would define everything that came after. I was not going to confront him with emotion. I was not going to scream or cry in front of him or ask him to explain himself while my voice broke. I had seen too many women do that, only to be talked back into the relationship with apologies and promises, while the man simply got better at hiding things the second time around. I was going to find out the truth first, quietly, completely. And then I was going to decide what to do with my life, not what to do about him, but what to do with my own future, based on facts, not feelings.
Over the next 3 weeks, I didn't say a word to Emmanuel about what I'd seen. I want to walk you through how I uncovered the rest, because the depth of what he was hiding surprised even me. I started paying closer attention to things I'd taken for granted. Not snooping through his phone, I never touched it. And that matters because the next part of this story doesn't rely on me invading his privacy. It relies on me finally opening my eyes to things that had been visible the whole time. His new wristwatch, for one. I asked a friend who knew about such things to glance at a photo of it, casually, without explaining why. She told me it wasn't a cheap imitation. It cost more than Emmanuel's entire monthly salary. His shoes, same story. Designer, not market bought. Not something a man earning what he earned could justify on a whim, not while claiming his money was tied up in equipment. Then there was the woman herself. I hadn't gotten a clear look at her face that day, but I'd seen her outfit, her bag, the boutique she'd walked out of. That boutique had an Instagram page where they tagged customers in posts, a marketing tactic to encourage others to buy. I scrolled through weeks of posts, slowly, methodically, until I found her. Bella, according to her own page, was a masterclass in the kind of lifestyle people assume is effortless. New outfits weekly, trips to Dubai, a stop in London, an upscale Lagos beach resort. Designer bags featured almost like a personal catalogue. She never tagged her boyfriend publicly, no identifying photos, no relationship status. But there were clues if you knew what to look for, and by then I did. A photo of a dinner table, 2 plates, a hand reaching for a wine glass in the background, wearing a wristwatch I just confirmed the price of 3 days earlier. A caption under a new phone she'd just been gifted, thankful for the people who see my worth. Posted the same week, Emmanuel told me he couldn't contribute his usual amount because a client had delayed payment. A video of her unboxing a designer bag saying her guy always knew how to make her feel like a queen, that he never let her carry last when it came to anything she wanted. I sat with that phrase for a long time. Never let her carry last. Meanwhile, I had carried everything for our wedding almost entirely on my own back, while being told his money was tied up, his schedule demanding, his business about to finally pay us for us. Based on the boutique prices, the watch, the trips, the gifts, and how often new items appeared on her page, it wasn't hard to estimate that what he'd spent maintaining Bella's lifestyle over that period was significant, possibly close to everything I'd saved for our entire wedding. I couldn't know the exact figure, and by that point it almost didn't matter. What mattered was the shape of the betrayal. While I chose sacrifice, he chose to fund someone else's comfort and lied to my face about why there was nothing left over. I considered reaching out to Bella directly, telling her the truth about who Emmanuel really was to me. I thought about it seriously for almost a day, but I decided against it.
Whatever happened between Bella and Emmanuel once the truth came out was their business to sort out, not mine to manage. My responsibility was to myself and to the life I still had a chance to build, with or without him. So, I made my decision.
I know what a lot of people watching this expect right now. The confrontation scene, the moment where I show up at the boutique or wait outside his office or invite Bella for coffee and lay out the truth in front of both of them. That's the version of this story that would have given me a single explosive moment of release. I didn't do that. And I want to explain why, because I think it's the most important decision I made in this entire story. A loud confrontation gives the other person something to respond to. It gives them a stage. Emmanuel was a smart man, careful with his words, good at managing how he was perceived. You don't fund a secret second life for over a year without becoming skilled at managing perception. If I had confronted him with raw emotion, he would have had room to apologize, to cry, to promise to end it immediately, to beg me not to throw away everything we'd built. And some quiet, exhausted part of me, the part that had loved him for 4 years, might have believed him. People do. Women smarter than me have stayed in worse situations because a well-timed apology landed on a tired heart. I didn't trust myself to stay strong in that moment, so I removed the moment entirely. Instead, about a month after I saw him in the plaza, I sat Emmanuel down, calmly, without any indication that I knew anything, and told him I wanted to talk about the wedding budget honestly, one more time, before we moved forward with any vendor bookings. I asked him directly, how much in total did he currently have saved toward the wedding? He gave me a number, a specific, confident number stated without hesitation, the kind of number a man gives when he's used to lying smoothly. It was significantly less than what I had saved, but he framed it as temporary. The business was about to turn a corner, he said. A few pending payments were about to clear, and once they did, he'd make up the difference quickly. I nodded. I told him that sounded reasonable. I told him I trusted him to handle his side and that I would continue handling mine. Inside, I had already made my decision. I just didn't tell him what it was. The next day, I went to my bank. I moved every single kobo out of the Sharon's Big Day account, the wedding savings account he knew about, the one he'd been quietly counting on as a financial cushion for the wedding he wasn't actually fully funding. And I put it into a brand new account, one he didn't know existed, one with no name attached to a wedding, no name attached to him at all. I didn't steal from him. I want to be completely clear about that. Every single naira in that account was money I personally earned and personally saved through 2 years of sacrifice he had never matched. I wasn't stealing from him. I was simply refusing to let money I had worked for fund a wedding with a man who was funding someone else's life with whatever he wasn't giving to ours. I didn't end the relationship that day. I know that might be confusing to hear given everything I knew by that point, but I needed time to plan, and ending things impulsively without a clear next step would have left me vulnerable in ways I wasn't willing to risk. I had watched too many women leave relationships in a blaze of righteous anger, only to end up financially worse off than before because they burned everything down before they had something solid to stand on. So for the next several weeks, I quietly continued the relationship on the surface, while underneath I was building an exit. I started researching what I actually wanted to do with the life I had ahead of me, a life that, increasingly, I understood was not going to include a wedding to Emmanuel. I had always had an idea sitting quietly at the back of my mind, something I'd mentioned to friends in passing, something I'd half joked about during slow afternoons at my accounts job. I was good with numbers. I was good with organizing small businesses, the kind of informal shops and traders who needed someone to make sense of their finances but couldn't afford a full accounting firm. Several of my freelance bookkeeping clients had told me more than once that I should turn this into something bigger, a proper service, not just a side hustle I did on weekends for extra cash. I had never seriously pursued it because pursuing it would have meant taking risks with money I didn't have to spare. Money that for 2 years had been earmarked entirely for a wedding. Now, that money was sitting in an account with no wedding attached to it. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself ask a different question. What did I actually want to build? I spent 2 weeks researching properly. I spoke to a cousin who ran a small registered business, asking her about the registration process, the costs involved, what mistakes to avoid. I looked into what licenses I'd need to formally offer bookkeeping and small business accounting services. I drafted a simple business plan on a notebook I bought specifically for that purpose, writing and rewriting it during my lunch breaks, in the back of buses, in the quiet hour before bed. I decided to start small and deliberate. I wasn't going to rent a fancy office immediately or hire staff I couldn't yet afford. I registered a business name. I used a portion of my savings to get proper accounting software, to print professional materials, to set up a simple but credible online presence. I kept the rest as a financial caution because I had learned painfully the value of always having something set aside that nobody else could touch or count on. I called the business Sharon Ademi and Associates. Simple, direct, my own name standing at the front of something for the first time in my adult life. My first clients were people I already knew, the same small shop owners I'd been doing freelance bookkeeping for, plus 2 new referrals from my cousin's network. I worked harder in those first few months than I think I had ever worked in my life, not because anyone was forcing me to, but because for the first time, every hour of effort was building something that was entirely, undeniably mine. Nobody could quietly redirect this success towards someone else's lifestyle. Nobody could tell me my money was tied up while spending freely elsewhere. There was no elsewhere. There was just the business and me, and the slow, steady proof that discipline eventually pays a return. Meanwhile, I was still, to Emmanuel's knowledge, his fiancée, still supposedly saving for our wedding. I let him believe the wedding planning had simply slowed down due to me being busy with a new side project. He didn't ask too many questions about it. In hindsight, I think he was relieved because it meant he didn't have to explain why his own promised contributions to the wedding kept failing to materialize. I ended things with Emmanuel about 4 months after I saw him in that plaza. Not with an explosive confrontation, not with tears, not even with the full truth about what I knew. I simply told him that I had been doing a lot of thinking, that I didn't feel we were aligned anymore on what we wanted from a shared future, and that I thought it was best we ended the engagement. He was shocked. He asked more than once if there was someone else, if he'd done something wrong, if there was anything he could fix. I told him honestly that some things simply can't be fixed once you've seen them clearly. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need him to understand. I needed to walk away with my dignity and my savings intact, and I did exactly that. I gave back the engagement ring, I packed up the small number of things I'd left at his place over the years, and I walked into the next chapter of my life carrying nothing of his. No resentment I let myself dwell on publicly, no debt, no shared financial mess to untangle, because I had quietly protected myself months before I ever said goodbye.
I didn't watch Emmanuel's life closely after we broke up. I made a deliberate choice to stop checking, stop wondering, stop letting his choices occupy space I needed for building my own future. But Lagos is a small world in certain circles, and over the following 2 years, pieces of information reached me anyway, through mutual friends, through the casual mentions that happen at parties and family gatherings. From what I gathered, here's roughly how things unfolded for him. Without my wedding savings to quietly lean on, savings he'd apparently been counting on more heavily than I'd realized, his financial situation grew noticeably tighter. The business he'd always referenced turned out to be far less substantial than he'd presented it as being. A few genuine clients, yes, but nowhere near enough to fund the lifestyle he'd been displaying, and certainly not Bella's boutique habits, her trips, her gifts. He'd been sustaining a lot of that through his salary, increasing debt and, I strongly suspect, though I can't prove it, money that should have gone toward our shared future.
Once I removed my financial cushion from the equation and his own resources kept being stretched by Bella's expectations, the math stopped working. I heard he lost his logistics job about a year and a half after we broke up. Performance issues, missed targets, possibly distraction. I heard his relationship with Bella ended around the same time. Apparently, and this surprised even me, Bella was the one who ended it, not gently. From what acquaintances described, she left once it became clear the lifestyle he'd been funding for her was no longer sustainable. The trip stopped, the gifts stopped, and so did her interest. I want to sit on that for a second because it's an important truth this story reveals. Devotion built on spending, rather than genuine partnership, rarely survives the absence of money. Bella was never loyal to Emmanuel. She was loyal to what he provided. The moment the providing stopped, so did she. I felt something complicated hearing that. Not joy exactly, I want to be honest, because pretending I felt nothing but triumphant satisfaction would be dishonest. I felt a quiet, sad recognition. He had built an entire deception, sacrificed our future, sacrificed my trust, sacrificed 2 years of my discipline for a relationship that was never going to outlast his bank balance. All of it for nothing real. After that, things got harder for him. No steady job, strained friendships with people tired of lending him money he repaid slowly, if at all. A falling out with at least one family member over funds he'd borrowed and not returned. Money I now suspect had also been funneled toward maintaining appearances he could no longer afford. I generally stopped following the story after that point. I had my own life, growing in a direction I was proud of, and I didn't need his decline to validate my choices. My choices were already validated every month by my own bank statements, my own growing client list, and my own name on a business that was mine. While his life was unraveling in the background, mine was doing the opposite, slowly and then quickly, in the way that real, sustainable growth tends to happen. Sharon Adeyemi and Associates grew steadily over those first 2 years. I reinvested almost everything back into the business early on. Better software, a small rented office once I outgrew working from home. Eventually, my first hire, a bright young graduate I trained personally to handle smaller clients while I focused on growing relationships with bigger ones. I won't pretend it was easy. There were tight months, nights I sat with my notebook recalculating numbers, wondering if I'd made the right call walking away from a stable account job to build something uncertain. Building from nothing is its own kind of sacrifice, just like saving for a wedding had been. Except this time, every sacrifice was building something that belonged entirely to me. By the second year, word of mouth had done a lot of the work. One early client, a fabric importer, grew significantly and brought me on to handle increasingly complex accounts as her business expanded and recommended me to other importers in her network. I expanded beyond basic bookkeeping into broader small business financial consulting. By the third year, I had 12 employees, a proper office in a respectable part of Lagos, and a client list that included several mid-sized companies, though I made sure never to abandon the kind of client I'd started with. I'm not telling you this to brag. Every single thing I built came from the same discipline that was once mistaken for naivety. The discipline of working hard, saving carefully, trusting the wrong person with that effort. The difference was, once I redirected that discipline entirely toward myself, it multiplied in ways I hadn't expected. I didn't rush into another relationship. I dated occasionally, carefully, with an awareness of red flags I simply hadn't had before. I wasn't bitter because bitterness curdles you, and I refused to let what he did make me harder and more closed off than I wanted to be. But I was wiser. I asked more questions earlier. I paid attention to inconsistencies instead of explaining them away. By the time 4 years had passed since that day in the shopping plaza, my company had grown into a respected mid-sized financial consulting firm, handling accounts and growth strategy for businesses across several sectors. We were actively, steadily hiring because demand had outpaced what our current team could comfortably handle. That's the position I was in when this story reaches the moment I think you've been waiting for. We had posted an opening for a logistics and operations coordinator,
a role suited for someone with a background in supply chain or logistics management, since we'd recently taken on several clients in the import and distribution space who needed that specific expertise integrated into our consulting team. We received a strong pool of applications. My HR manager shortlisted the top candidates, and as was standard for mid to senior roles at our firm, I sat in on final interviews personally, alongside 2 other members of my leadership team. I liked staying close to hiring decisions, especially for roles that would interact directly with clients. It was one of the small ways I maintained the kind of quality control that had built our reputation in the first place. I didn't look closely at every name on the shortlist beforehand. We had 6 candidates that week, back-to-back interviews, a long day ahead. I glanced at resumes quickly between sessions, noting qualifications, not lingering on names. The 4th candidate of the day was listed as Emmanuel. I want to be honest, even seeing the first name didn't immediately register as significant. Emmanuel is not a rare name. I'd worked with at least 3 other Emmanuels in my professional life since the engagement ended. I didn't think much of it as my assistant called the candidate in. The door opened, and there he was. 4 years had changed him. He looked thinner than I remembered. His clothes neat, but noticeably more modest than the sharp, expensive style he'd worn back when he was funding Bella's Lifestyl. There was a tiredness in his face, the kind that comes from a few hard years, not just one bad week. He walked in with the practiced, slightly nervous confidence of someone who genuinely needed this job to work out. He didn't recognize me immediately. I was seated at the head of the table, slightly turned away as I reviewed his resume one more time, and the room had 2 other interviewers seated alongside me, which probably diffused his attention in those first few seconds. Then he looked up properly, and I watched in real time the exact moment recognition landed on his face. His expression didn't go through anger or defensiveness or any of the dramatic reactions you might expect. It went through something quieter and I think more honest, a kind of stunned, sinking realization. The realization that the small, sacrificing woman he remembered, the one who used to negotiate plastic chair prices down by 50 naira, the one whose savings he quietly counted on while funding someone else's comfort, that woman was now sitting at the head of the table he needed to impress, holding his future employment in her hands. I didn't say anything dramatic, I didn't smile in a way that would have signaled triumph, and I didn't let my expression harden into something cold either. I simply looked at him, the way you'd look at any candidate walking into an interview, and I said, "Good afternoon, please have a seat." His voice, when he responded, had lost some of its old ease. "Good afternoon, ma," he said. Just that, formal, careful, the way you address someone whose power over your immediate future you are suddenly acutely aware of. I conducted the interview the same way I conducted every interview that day, professionally, asking about his experience, his understanding of logistics coordination, how he'd handle specific scenarios relevant to the role. He answered as best as he could, his composure clearly rattled beneath the surface, his answers slightly less sharp than they might have been with a stranger across the table instead of me. At one point, one of my colleagues, unaware of our history, asked him a standard question. "Tell us about a time you had to manage competing financial priorities and make a difficult resource allocation decision." I watched him pause, just slightly longer than the question warranted. I watched something thicker behind his eyes. Maybe memory, maybe shame, maybe both. He gave a generic textbook answer about a previous job, vague enough that I doubted it was even true. I didn't react. I simply wrote a note on my TAD, the same way I'd written notes for every other candidate that day, and moved on to the next question. Near the end of the interview, there was a brief lull while my colleague checked something on her laptop. In that lull, Emmanuel looked directly at me, properly, for the first time since he'd walked in, and opened his mouth slightly, like he wanted to say something outside the bounds of the formal interview. Maybe an apology, maybe an explanation, maybe just my name, said quietly, an attempt to bridge the 4 years and the entire history between us with a single word. I held his gaze, calm and unreadable, and said nothing. I simply waited, the way you'd wait for any candidate to finish gathering their thoughts before continuing with a professional question. He closed his mouth. He looked down at his resume instead, and the moment passed. That was it. No speech, no reference to the past, no mention of Bella, of the wedding savings, of the plaza, of any of it. Just silence, held for a few seconds too long to be entirely comfortable in a room full of people who had no idea
what that silence actually contained. I think that silence said more than any words could have. It told him without a single accusation that I knew exactly who he was, that I remembered exactly what he'd done, and that none of it mattered enough to even warrant being spoken aloud. He wasn't important enough in my present life to earn a confrontation. He was just a candidate in a chair, hoping for a job at a company built from the very discipline he'd once taken for granted. After he left the room, my colleagues moved on to discussing the next candidate, completely unaware of what had just happened beneath the surface of that interview. I let the conversation continue normally. I gave my honest professional assessment of his qualifications, separate entirely from anything personal, because I want to be clear about something important. I did not disqualify him out of spite, and I did not give him special treatment out of guilt or lingering affection either. His qualifications on their own merit were decent but not exceptional. Several years of relevant experience, reasonable knowledge of logistics coordination, but noticeably less polished and less current than two of the other candidates we interviewed that week. Gaps in his resume that likely reflected the unstable years he'd had since his job loss, the kind of gaps that happen to anyone going through genuine hardship. We ultimately hired a different candidate for the role, a woman with more recent, more relevant experience who interviewed more confidently and presented clearer examples of relevant work. It was by every professional measure my team applied that week the correct decision, completely independent of Emmanuel's history with me. I want to be honest that there was a version of this moment where I could have used my position to either punish him further or rescue him out of some lingering sense of guilt. I did neither. I let the process be exactly what it was supposed to be: fair, professional, blind to the personal history sitting quietly underneath it. He never reached out to me afterwards. No message, no attempt at the conversation he might have wanted to have in that brief lull during the interview. I don't know, to this day, what he made of that encounter, what he told himself about it afterward, whether he understood the full weight of what that silence meant, or simply filed it away as an unfortunate coincidence and moved on with his job search elsewhere. I haven't heard anything about him since, and for the first time in this entire story, I can say that honestly without it costing me anything emotionally. I'm not curious anymore. I'm not checking. I'm not waiting for an update. His story simply isn't connected to mine in any way that matters now, except as the chapter that taught me the most important lesson of my adult life. I think about those 2 years of saving often, not with regret, but with a strange kind of gratitude I never expected to feel. Every kobo I saved while believing I was building a wedding was actually, without my knowing it, building my exit. Every sacrifice I made while he was quietly funding someone else's comfort was teaching me a discipline that would eventually fund something far more lasting than a single day of celebration ever could have. I didn't get the wedding I spent 2 years planning for. I got something else instead. A business with my name on it. A team of 12 people who depend on me to lead well. A level of independence I'm not sure I would have ever pursued if I hadn't been forced to. I'm not grateful to Emmanuel. I want to be clear about that, because I think some of these stories try too hard to find a silver lining in someone else's cruelty. And I don't think that's fair to the woman who lived through the sacrifice without knowing the betrayal underneath it. I'm not grateful to him. I'm grateful to the version of myself who chose to build something quietly instead of waiting for an apology that was never coming, or fighting for a man who had already made his choice long before I caught him making it. If you are listening to this and you recognize even a small piece of your own story in mine, the unexplained busyness, the money that's always tied up, the sacrifices that only seem to flow in one direction, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need to confront, expose, or punish anyone to find your way to peace. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply to take what's yours, build something undeniable with it, and let time and consequence do the rest of the work for you. Choose yourself, quietly if you have to, loudly if you are ready, but choose yourself every single time. Thank you for listening to my story. If this meant something to you, let me know in the comments, and if you want to hear what happened in the weeks after, including a conversation I eventually did have with Bella, let me know below, because that's a story for another day.